I'd like to welcome you to this session from where I am currently, in Benghazi, Libya. I am Dr. Khaled al Haddar, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Benghazi and Director of the Stolen Antiquities Office of the Eastern Libyan Department of Antiquities. I'd like to thank ASOR for this invitation, and I'd like to provide an overview of the looting and theft of Libyan antiquities since 2011. This is a general view of Libya, highlighting a number of the key archaeological sites scattered throughout the country. You get a sense that the sites are numerous and that also the border is vast, largely passing through desert areas which are difficult to control. You can imagine that this makes it very difficult to protect all of these sites at a moment where day to day we face new challenges. After 2011, the same sense of instability that we've seen throughout the Middle East and North Africa following the Arab Spring has been really a part of our reality in Libya as well. Since the revolution, we've seen the destruction of a number of our most cherished sites, including the Islamic era tombs of Zuela, the Byzantine church in Latrun, the tombs of the necropolis of Cyrene. And a lot of this destruction has often been motivated by religious extremists, making it very difficult and even dangerous to prevent. This topic of theft or looting of Libyan antiquities is really nothing new. This kind of pattern of pressure existed even under the Ottoman or Italian colonial powers. And a lot of antiquities from Libya, which were taken centuries ago from our country, are now on display in over 50 museums around the world. This is an example, in fact, one of the earliest examples of a sculpture that was taken from Libya, which left back in 1695 and is now in France. Libyan statues were part of the early collections at some of the most prominent museums in the world, including the Louvre in France and the British Museum in London. Here are a few further examples of Libyan material that was taken, from Libya back in the 18th or 19th centuries. One of the most prominent examples that we know of is this sculpture here. This is the Venus of Cyrene, and it was taken by the Italian colonial power back in 1913. It was later returned, thankfully, to us in Libya back in 2008 through steady work through diplomatic channels. Here's another similar story. Another fine sculpture that was taken from Leptis Magna, again by the Italian colonial powers, and returned to Libya back in 1999. Following the Italian colonial period, in the moment of rupture of the Second World War, that instability took its toll as well. And we know back then a number of museums that already had been established and already had fine collections suffered the effects of war, including the material you'll see here, which were stolen from the museums in Susa and in Tolmaeus. Interestingly, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as Libya reopened to the world, the pressure on Libyan museums and storerooms actually increased, and we suffered a number of instances of theft, whether in Susa or Sabratha or the storerooms of the American mission in Cyrene. Here's an example of a statue stolen from the Museum of the Baths in Cyrene in 1990. And here's a Roman bust that was stolen from Sabratha also back in 1990, which eventually showed up in a Christie's catalog and was thankfully returned to Libya in 2012. Here are a couple more examples of the material taken from Sabratha around the same time. And here are a couple of additional examples of material stolen from Cyrene back in 2000. And this one in 1990. This distinctive bust was taken from Ptolemais, again in 1990. On occasion, material that was more pharaonic in origin was also targeted. This taken from the museum in Susa. And then a portion of the sculpture of the Three Graces in the museum in Cyrene, also taken and eventually returned. And here, in 2005, as the Libyan government contributed a number of pieces to an international exposition, encouraging the world to connect with our rich history. Unfortunately, as this traveling exhibition made it to Tokyo, these two pieces were reported missing. And here are a whole series of heads that were taken from Cyrene back in 2000. Additional material taken from Tokra, the museum in Derna. And here, one of those very same heads taken from Derna, the museum there, we know it eventually made it to the international market, and it showed up here on an auction site in Israel. This material is often diverse. It's not all Roman or Greek. Here, a Byzantine inscription taken from Sabratha. And all of these examples that I've just mentioned happened during a time in our history when the Libyan state was much more stable and functional, when we enjoyed actually more security than we do today. So you can imagine that the situation has become more difficult in the absence of rule of law since 2011. I'm going to quickly now describe some of the incidents that have happened since the beginning of the revolution. Here are a series of Attic vessels that were stolen from the museum in Susa back in July of 2011. And we must really mention the case of the Beni Walid Museum, which suffered a series of thefts back in 2011, in 2013, and again in 2016. This single site has been targeted more than any other. Here are some of the objects taken from Beni Walid, including these carved funerary urns, as well as a large collection of Roman-era oil lamps. The Misrata Museum also suffered theft back in 2011, and unfortunately, we don't even have adequate photo documentation of the pieces that were taken, so we just have rough description of relatively large collections of coins. And we really must discuss the single largest theft in the history of Libya, the so-called Benghazi treasure, in which nearly 10,000 pieces, mostly coins and small high-value archaeological finds, were stolen from the National Commercial Bank on Omar Mukhtar Street in Benghazi back in 2011. The story of this theft is relatively complicated, but it's worth mentioning that some small subset of this material, approximately 2,000 or 3,000 pieces, still remained after the initial theft. And we at the Department of Antiquities thought that we had been able to store it safely. But during the Battle of Benghazi between 2014 and 2017, armed conflict took control of the location of storage, and we lost the remainder. A big problem we have is that, of course, most of the material taken from most of the material that makes up the Benghazi treasure was never photo documented or published. And so a lot of what we've lost, we don't even have a strong description of what it once was. This stands in stark contrast to the kinds of photos that we see here, taken from the excavations of the Temple of Demeter in Cyrene, where every small find was associated with a detailed photograph. Thankfully, in some cases, a small portion of the Benghazi treasure does enjoy this kind of documentation. These are a number of objects that had been excavated in Ptolemais back in the 1930s. We consider them as having been part of the Benghazi treasure, and thankfully for these items, we actually do have a photograph and some hope that we might eventually recover them. Here's some collections of coins where likewise we think that they're part of the Benghazi treasure, currently missing, but we do have some photographs of this material. And again, coming from diverse periods, all the way from Hellenistic times to Islamic coins. And then finally, the material which sort of remained after 2011, the last subset of this collection, we actually did document this in the Department of Antiquities. So we do have some, for that subset that was stolen between 2014 and 2017 during the Battle of Benghazi, we do have some photo documentation of that part of the treasure. We see a lot of evidence of local authorities, whether in Libya or in neighboring states like Egypt or Tunisia, seizing materials that appear to have been looted in Libya. This material is clearly also making it to an international art market, like this head, which was recovered by Swiss authorities. And one of the most distinctive bits of proof for this international trade really relates to the wide distribution of these funerary statues from the Cyrenaica. Again, these definitely originate in Libya's eastern province. There's no other place in the ancient world where this material is recorded as having been produced. And in recent years, large numbers of them have surfaced on the international art market. In this case, nearly 10 of them found at a gallery in Spain. Here are a few more examples. Similar material, very Cyrenaic in origin, but making it to an international market. Or this material, again, very similar in its quality, intercepted at the Egyptian port of Damietta back in 2015. Here's another series of funeral busts that were recovered in France in recent years. Here's one that was famously recovered in London back in 2012, where a court has subsequently ruled that it must be returned to Libya. Or these busts, which were recovered in Switzerland, in part thanks to the Red List, which was prepared by ICOM with the support of the US State Department. That list really enabled local authorities to identify this material as suspicious, potentially coming from Libya, and that's since been confirmed so that we can hope to recover this material. And for an American audience, it's particularly interesting and important to focus on a couple of cases here. This fragmentary head, which was recovered in the US back in 2008. And thanks to the bilateral memorandum of understanding for cultural property signed between the United States and Libya back in 2018, this head was returned to the Libyan embassy in Washington by Homeland Security investigations back in 2019. Very similar story with the Cyrenaic and funerary bust, which was seized in New York and will be returned to Libya thanks to the assistance of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement as well as Homeland Security investigations. These are just a few examples which demonstrate the pressure which Libyan antiquities currently face. These are the recorded instances for which we have actual evidence, but you can imagine that in most cases we have no record and only a suspicion that the trade continues unabated. Here are some examples of material recovered by Tunisian authorities, all of which likely originated in Libya. You can see here, the typical kind of small ceramic vessels, coins, small busts, as well as occasional metal tools and implements. And in too many cases, we're left asking ourselves, what is the reason behind all of this looting? I should mention that in addition to the materials seen here in the photographs, there's evidence that Jewish manuscripts have been smuggled from the Nafusa mountains of western Libya into Tunisia. So again, getting back to the motivating factors for all this looting, Libyan citizens typically lack awareness about the importance of their history, or often feel that Roman or Greek material does not necessarily mean that it's part of Libyan heritage. So this, in a sense, a lot of this material feels like a fair or legitimate target. Local law enforcement has become weaker, of course, in recent years as well, and it's been harder to investigate or prosecute crimes. Finally, it's also become easier to find buyers for this material using the electronic marketplace or social media sites. So you can imagine that this material is currently leaving Libya through every possible opening or route. We, of course, have plenty of evidence that illegal excavations continue, particularly around the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Cyrene. But there really are many things that we can and must do to counter and prevent this illicit trafficking. First, we can increase our outreach to Libyan citizens, enlisting their help to really prevent this trade. We can and should build out and continue to populate a comprehensive database of all of the Libyan antiquities that currently exist in museums and storerooms to ensure that in case of a future theft, at the very least, we have baseline documentation that enables us to recover the material and prevent it from being sold on the international art market. We need to increase the cooperation between law enforcement and Libyan archaeologists. In order to make any progress with this problem, we need to work together. We need to also support the offices of stolen antiquities that have been set up by the Department of Antiquities in the East and West in order to help pursue these investigations and build out these cases convincingly. And finally, we could really benefit from a more practical or expanded version of the ICOM Red List that really helps our local authorities who don't have a strong background in antiquities do a better job of recognizing frequently looted material. We know in the end that we've really lost so much in recent years, but we really look forward to continuing to cooperate with global partners, international organizations such as UNESCO or ICOM. I'm so glad to be able to join all of you today here at ASOR, and we certainly look forward to continuing to cooperate with ASOR in the years to come. We see there's a lot of work that needs to be done to counter and prevent this illicit trafficking, but we know that none of this will be possible without the support of our international colleagues. Thank you.